There are places in the universe where time does not follow rules, where reality does not bend to the will of men, but to the hunger of something older. Places where those who arrive never leave the same way. Odyssey 4 floated in the orbit of Calliope, a moon without a name on official maps, forgotten among the debris of an asteroid belt. For the crew, it was nothing more than a temporary detour, a whim of Jonas Merak, the pilot, who insisted on making a small stop before proceeding with their mining mission. What they didn't know was the real reason. Jonas descended alone, in the auxiliary module, passing through the moon's thin violet atmosphere. Dark clouds loomed above, shifting erratically, as if something within them was alive, breathing. When he landed, he realized that Calliope was not completely dead. The landscape was a paradox. Black, smooth monoliths jutted from the ground like obsidian thorns, yet cast no shadow. Worn stone staircases spiraled upward into the sky, leading nowhere. On the ground, geometric patterns were carved into the rock, impossible, inconsistent, changing every time he looked away. And at the center of it all there was her, Leyenda. She looked like a woman, but only in shape. Her skin was white as the bones of something that had never been human. Her eyes were black and deep, devoid of light, open windows into an endless void, a place where a soul could be lost forever. Jonas felt that if he stared too long, he would see something that was never meant to be seen. No one knew what Leyenda truly was. Some believed she was the last survivor of a forgotten civilization. Others whispered darker theories, an echo of something that should never have taken human form. She did not speak. She did not move. She only watched. Jonas opened his mouth to say something, but Leyenda raised her hand, and silence became absolute. Then, she showed him the future. Silence was not merely the absence of sound. It was an entity, a weight, something that seeped into Jonas's bones, coiling around his spine like rotten roots. He felt his throat tighten, his lungs refusing to draw air. His heart pounded erratically, unable to find a rhythm that made sense. He tried to move his fingers. Nothing. He tried to scream. Nothing. Only his mind existed now, floating in the void that had opened within Leyenda's eyes. And then, the visions began. Pain. It came without warning, without mercy. Like invisible, needles piercing his mind, tearing it apart into two possible futures. In the first, he returned home empty-handed. He worked until his bones turned to dust, grinding himself down to insignificance. His son, sick and frail, lay on a metallic hospital bed in a distant colony, dying without treatment. He saw the funeral, saw the lifeless eyes of the child inside a glass coffin, saw his empty bank account, saw his own uselessness before an unrelenting universe. In the second, he saw gold, wealth, glory. He saw his name etched into history, saw his son alive, running, smiling, his eyes filled with hope. But among these images of a grand future, something lurked. Blood. So much blood. Dripping through his fingers, pooling on the metallic floor of Odyssey 4, staining the walls, dripping from the ceiling. It was warm, fresh, and he knew whose it was. Jonas tried to look away, but Leyenda did not allow it. You already know the price. Her voice did not come through his ears. It was inside him, crawling through his thoughts like something viscous and cold, soft as wet silk, suffocating as a burial shroud pressed against his bare skin. Jonas closed his eyes, but the voice was still there, pulsing inside his skull like an endless echo. He had always known. And if I accept? Leyenda smiled. Her lips were too thin, stretched as if her skin were made of melting wax beneath an invisible flame. From the folds of her pale mantle she produced a small vial. Inside it a single drop of white pulsing liquid. Something alive. Spill this. Jonas took the vial. The glass was warm, throbbing in his hand like a heart freshly torn from someone's chest. The drop moved inside, an eye, focusing on him, staring, watching. He felt the thing inside the vial gazing directly into his soul. And then, Leyenda did not answer. She merely ran her fingers along the face of one of her servants, and that was when Jonas saw them. Humanoid creatures, thin, gaunt, pale as the dead moon itself, huddled around Leyenda like dogs waiting for scraps of meat. Were they human? No. They were something that had once been human, something undone and remade incorrectly, as if a wicked hand had molded their flesh like impure clay. Their bodies were elongated, too dry, too taut over their bones. But their heads, they had no eyes. Nothing existed above the nose. The flesh stretched smooth and unbroken, as if something had erased the upper halves of their skulls. Their chests rose and fell with wet, irregular, erratic breaths. And below their noses, only mouths. Mouths far too large. Mouths torn open to where their ears should have been. Mouths clenched shut, packed with rows of gray teeth, layered like those of a starving shark. Mouths chewing at nothing, thin bluish tongues licking their own cracked lips. They were parasites of something no one should ever comprehend. They were hers. They crawled closer, sightless, voiceless, the only sound their ragged breathing and the grinding of teeth against their own lips. Leyenda caressed one of them tenderly. Her fingers traced the stretched skin where a face should have been, drawing soft curves like a mother touching her newborn child. The servant trembled and let out a muffled whimper. It was not a human sound. It was wet, a choked sob, a wheeze, something trying to speak without enough mouths to do so. Jonas felt bile rise in his throat. His stomach twisted and he knew he should not be here. But it was too late. Go now, sweet Jonas, and return when you have fulfilled your part of the bargain. Leyenda's voice was soft, sweet as poison dissolved in wine. Jonas did not argue. His fingers tightened around the pulsing vial. His chest swelled with the weight of a decision that had already been made for him, and his soul screamed in silence. The mess hall of Odyssey 4 was a refuge from the exhaustion of space. Cards slapped against the metal table, voices tangled in jokes told too many times, and the thin scent of weak coffee clung to the air, always warm, always tasting of rust and fatigue. It was the kind of mundane moment that made life in the void a little less unbearable. No one there felt fear. No one sensed the inevitable, already sealed. Merak must be lost out there again, Dorian the engineer joked, shuffling the deck with a grin. Or he found some junkyard to rummage through. Or fell into a hole and is trying to fake an abduction so he doesn't have to admit he's an idiot. The laughter was genuine, human. It was the last time they would ever hear something like that. Then the door opened, and silence came before the figure. He stood at the entrance, a motionless shadow in the frame of the automatic door. His face was pale, bloodless, soulless. His eyes, deep like dark craters, stared at nothing. Sweat dripped from his forehead, falling like melted wax, and his hands trembled as if they carried the weight of the universe itself. But the worst part was the vial, tiny, insignificant, and yet as heavy as a sin that could never be redeemed. So, Jonas, did you get what you wanted? Dorian asked, not even looking up from his cards. Jonas didn't answer. He looked at the faces before him. Familiar faces, men and women who had trusted him, who had shared jokes, smuggled cigarettes, spent endless nights in empty conversations. People who had given him their respect, their friendship, their loyalty. People who didn't know they were already dead. He took a deep breath, and then he opened his hand. The vial tipped over. The drop hit the metal floor, and silence spread. Jonas couldn't breathe. His shoulders trembled and something burned inside him, something irreversible, something he had always known would happen. He didn't want to look, but he had to. The crew of Odyssey 4 was motionless, scattered across the floor, slumped over the tables, their faces twisted in expressions of fear and despair. Mouths slightly open, eyes wide, muscles still rigid from the sudden death. His friends, his brothers of space. And now, they weren't just dead. They were still there. but they were no longer awake. Jonas's chest rose and fell, fast and erratic. His body wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. He could feel the things, moving in the mist, exploring, burrowing into the bodies of his former crewmates. They would never open their eyes again. But that didn't mean they were empty. Something filled them now. Something he had brought aboard. Something Leyenda had been waiting for. He knew she was smiling, even now, even from so far away. And now, Jonas could never go back. His face sank into his hands, fingers digging into his own skin as if he could tear himself apart right there. His lips trembled, and he whispered his son's name. The last thing that still justified it. The last thing that made him endure the weight of his own horror. But not even that could erase the absolute certainty that consumed him. He would never see them awake again. Jonas returned to the surface of Calliope alone. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Odyssey 4 was still there, empty, silent, drifting like a corpse abandoned in the cosmic ocean. And Jonas? Jonas was lost in a way that could never be undone. When the auxiliary module touched down on the dark, lifeless ground, Jonas knew something had changed. Something was growing here now. Something that hadn't been before. The hall. An impossible structure, rising in the middle of the barren stone desert, its columns twisted like exposed vertebrae, spiraling at angles the mind couldn't comprehend. The walls were made of petrified flesh covered in fissures and pulsing wrinkles, as if something immense slumbered within them, breathing in near imperceptible intervals. The air was humid, heavy with the scent of coagulated blood, of something, both alive and rotting at the same time. And at the center of the hall there was a table, long, crooked, too thin. Its material was a blend of polished bone and black metal, gleaming like sweaty skin under the spectral light of the dead moon. Across its surface, sinuous grooves seemed to shift whenever Jonas wasn't looking directly at them. On the other side of the table, she waited. Leyenda, Jonas watched her. She looked human, but she wasn't. She never had been. Her slender form, wrapped in pale fabrics, had curves that both attracted and repelled. Every movement was smooth, fluid, as if she did not obey the laws of gravity. Her shoulders were high and rigid, her waist narrow, her hands long, fingers too delicate to be made of. Mere flesh and bone, and her face. Her face was a perfect lie, sharp, elegant, shaped like a mask of cold porcelain. A beauty designed to deceive, to lure prey that would never return to tell the story. Her eyes, black as a starless sky, were windows into the void, deep wells where light entered but never escaped. And then there was her mouth, too small when closed, too large when she smiled. Her pale, thin lips stretched just a little further than they should, revealing a glimpse of something wrong, something that shouldn't be there. A flaw in the simulation of humanity, and without sound, she laughed. They returned. The servants. Gaunt, skeletal bodies, dragging themselves across the floor with erratic movements, as if their joints had been assembled incorrectly. They were cadaverous, but not dead. They were human, but no longer human. They were Leyenda's hounds. Their grotesque mouths, ripped open to where their ears should have been, moved in silence. Murmuring sounds with no tongue, no voice, no soul. They crawled to the table, placing the plates before Jonas. The aroma rose from the dish, sweet and sickly. It was warm, but carried the stench of rot, something between roasted meat and sour milk. Jonas looked at the food. The flesh was dark, dense, cut into perfect portions. He knew that smell. He recognized that texture. His fingers trembled above the table. Beside him, Leyenda smiled. With a slow gesture, she ran her cold, silk-soft fingers over the deformed face of one of her servants. The skin wrinkled beneath her touch, and the creature shuddered, murmuring something only understandable to those who had lost their sanity. "Join me in this banquet, sweet Jonas, and your desires shall be fulfilled." The invitation was a spell, A summons to something greater than human will. Jonas swallowed hard. He picked up the fork, picked up the knife. Leyenda watched. She always watched. He closed his eyes. The smell was familiar. Only the dead moon bore witness to what happened next. I should never have landed on that moon. It was just another routine shift mining ice fragments and rare minerals to sell on the black market. But then, I saw the ship. An impossible thing, dark as a hole in the sky, floating silently between the black stone canyons, and it was there waiting for me. My name is Cale Draven and I'm a space miner. I've worked alone for years, exploring forgotten moons in the far reaches of the solar system. It's a lonely job, but I prefer it that way. I have no patience for the politics of the big corporations or the judgmental stares of the colonists. Out here, I'm my own boss, and that's enough for me. That morning, if you can even call it morning in a place where the sun barely shows, I was extracting ice from a small moon orbiting a dead planet. The place was desolate, covered in layers of dust and jagged rocks. No one had been here for centuries, and I knew I could find something valuable without being disturbed. But then, something strange happened. While operating the excavator, I noticed a shadow pass at the edge of my visor. I thought it was some kind of reflection or a glitch in the equipment. After all, there was nothing out here but rock and emptiness. Or at least, that's what I thought. There's something wrong here, I murmured to myself, adjusting my ship's sensors. But the instruments detected nothing. No gravitational anomalies, no signs of life. Just silence. I decided to ignore it and kept working. Until I saw it. It looked alive. I can't explain it any other way. It was a ship, but not like any I had ever seen. Its surface was black as coal with jagged spires that resembled needles. Stained glass windows glowed faintly along its sides, casting red and gold lights that danced over the lunar dust. It looked like an ancient church, abandoned in deep space. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, frozen in place. My first reaction was fear. Who would build something like this? And why would it be here on a forgotten moon in the middle of nowhere? But fear was quickly replaced by curiosity. I had always been that way, unable to resist a mystery. Maybe it's an alien relic, I thought. If I can get inside, I might find something valuable. I landed my ship a few meters from the structure and suited up. As I approached, I realized the ship was even larger than it had seemed from a distance. Its spires stretched endlessly upward as if defying the laws of physics. There was something wrong about it. Something that made my stomach turn. The entrance was a massive door made of dark wood. Yes, wood. Carved with symbols I couldn't understand. I ran my fingers over its surface and it creaked softly as if inviting me inside. "Don't do this," a voice whispered in my head. But I ignored it. I pushed the door, and it opened with a slow, eerie groan. The interior was even more breathtaking and terrifying than I had imagined. The room was immense, with towering ceilings and Gothic columns that seemed to hold up the cosmos itself. The air was thick with a strange scent, something between incense and burned metal. In the center of the chamber sat a hooded figure on a chair that appeared to be made of bones. "Welcome, traveler," he said, his voice echoing like 1,000 whispers at once. "You seem interesting." I froze. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his eyes. If he even had eyes, watching me. He rose slowly, and I noticed that his cloak seemed to be woven from living shadows, shifting and twisting even as he stood still. Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He smiled, or at least I thought he did, though his mouth remained hidden beneath the hood. "I am the collector of lost stories, forgotten memories, and forbidden artifacts. You may call me the Black Merchant." "What do you want with me?" I asked, taking a step back. Nothing too complicated," he replied, his voice smooth yet unsettling. "I'm merely curious. You seem to possess something unique. But before that, allow me to show you a few pieces from my collection. Perhaps you'll find something interesting." And then he began walking through the chamber, gesturing toward strange objects displayed on pedestals. Each one seemed to pulse with its own energy, as if it were alive. "Let's start with this one," he said, stopping before an ancient mirror. "This is the Mirror of Inverted Desires. Have you heard of it?" And so the first story began. "This," said the merchant, pointing to an ancient mirror resting on a pedestal of black stone, "is the Mirror of Inverted Desires." I looked at the mirror, trying to understand what was so special about it. At first glance, it seemed like nothing, more than an old piece of abandoned furniture, its dark wooden frame cracked with age, its surface rippling like still water. But there was something wrong about it. When I leaned in for a closer look, I realized that my reflection wasn't right. My eyes seemed larger, my expression distorted, as if someone else were wearing my face. It was unsettling. It was found on an abandoned planet, the merchant continued, his voice smooth and hypnotic like a storyteller by the fire. A place where civilization collapsed millennia ago. Its last inhabitant was a woman named Lyra Solon. Lyra was a brilliant scientist, but a bitter one. She dedicated her life to unraveling the universe's secrets, yet she never found answers to her own questions. Why was she born on that desolate world? Why had her species failed so completely? I listened intently, trying to imagine what it would be like to live on a dead planet, surrounded only by ruins and memories. One day, while exploring the ruins of her home city, she found this mirror. It was buried beneath layers of dust and rubble, but when she touched it, it glowed with a cold light. Intrigued, she took it home and began studying it. But the mirror was not just an object, it was alive in a way. It whispered to her as she slept, promising to grant her deepest desires. And Lyra, weary of her empty existence, decided to test it. Her first wish was simple. She wanted wealth. She wanted to be remembered as someone important. The moment she formed the thought, the mirror flared with brilliant light. When she opened her eyes, everything around her had changed. Her laboratory was empty. Her tools had vanished. She stepped outside into the ruins and found that all the buildings had collapsed. There was no one left alive on the planet. She was the only survivor, and also the poorest. I swallowed hard, a chill running down my spine. The idea of making a wish only to receive the opposite was terrifying. Desperate, she tried again. This time she wished for power. She wanted to control the fate of her extinct people. The mirror glowed once more, and she awoke in a frail body, unable to move a single muscle. Her mind remained intact, but she was trapped in a cocoon of dead flesh. She screamed until she lost her voice, but no one could hear her. In the end, she begged to be freed. She pleaded for the mirror to erase her completely, and it did. When explorers found the planet years later, all that remained of her was a cracked skull, her empty eyes still locked onto the mirror. The merchant paused, watching my reaction. Fascinating, isn't it? This mirror still works, you know. But who would dare use it now? I stepped away from the mirror, an uneasy feeling creeping over me, as if it were trying to pull me in. I couldn't stop, thinking about what would happen if I touched it. The merchant walked over to another pedestal, where a golden mask rested atop a black cloth. The mask was covered in alien inscriptions that faintly glowed, like embers on the verge of burning out. I couldn't take my eyes off it. "This," he said, "is the mask of the World Devourer, an artifact created by a civilization that sought to see beyond the veil of time. They were an advanced race, far beyond what you humans can comprehend. They mastered the energy of stars, traveled between dimensions, and colonized entire galaxies. But there was one question that consumed them. What would be the final fate of their empire? I tried to imagine what it would be like to live in such an advanced civilization. Did they truly believe they could escape the inevitable collapse? To answer this, they created the mask. It allowed the wearer to see the future, but only the future of their own civilization. They chose their greatest leader, a man named Kyle, ardent to wear it. Kale placed the mask upon his face in a solemn ceremony before thousands of his people. The moment it touched his skin, he saw everything. He saw the downfall of his empire, brought upon by their own greed. He saw their cities reduced to dust, their stars extinguished, their worlds devoured by black holes. He witnessed billions of lives vanish in the blink of an eye. But the worst part was not what he saw. It was what he felt. The mask did not merely show the future. It made the wearer experience every moment of it. Kyle screamed for hours until his voice gave out. When they finally removed the mask, he was unrecognizable. His eyes had been replaced by empty sockets, and his skin had turned gray, as if he had aged 1,000 years in mere minutes. They kept him alive for some time, hoping he would explain what he had seen. But Kyle could not speak. All he did was point to the sky and weep. Eventually he died and the mask was sealed away, deemed cursed. The merchant smiled beneath his hood. They say it can still reveal the future, but who would dare wear it now? A shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't look away from the mask, as if it were whispering to me directly. Finally, the merchant stopped before a pulsing crystal shrouded in shadows. The crystal seemed to vibrate with a life of its own, emitting a faint glow that cast eerie patterns across the room. I stepped closer, cautiously, trying to understand what it was. This, he said, is the heart of a dead star. It was taken from the core of an embryonic black hole and holds the final moments of billions of lives. Long ago, a civilization sought to tame the power of the stars. They built colossal machines to extract energy from black holes, believing they could create an infinite source of power. But they underestimated the nature of these cosmic entities. One day during an extraction operation, something went wrong. The black hole began to collapse in on itself, consuming everything around it. Planets, stars, entire civilizations were devoured in seconds. The scientists tried to escape, but it was too late. In the final moment, one of them managed to extract something from the black hole's core before being consumed. This crystal. It holds the screams, thoughts, and memories of all who were swallowed. When touched, it allows the bearer to hear their voices, but at the cost of their own sanity. The last human who touched it was found dead, his eyes wide open and filled with terror. He had written a single phrase on his wall before succumbing. "They are here." I shook my head, stepping back. I didn't want to go anywhere near the crystal. It felt wrong. After presenting the 3 artifacts, the merchant turned his attention back to me. His invisible smile widened, and I felt an eerie sensation, as if he were evaluating me. "You seem impressed," he said. "But you still don't understand, do you? It's not about what I have here. It's about what you brought with you." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" The merchant took a step forward, his presence dominating the room. "You came here out of curiosity, but you didn't realize you were already being watched. Your mind, your soul, they are compatible with something I've been searching for a very long time." Before I could react, the merchant extended his hand and revealed a 4th artifact, the relic of the gate opener, a sinister object that pulsed with a dark energy. "This relic requires a sacrifice to function, and you, my dear miner, have just given me access to another world." The black merchant smiled beneath his hood, his invisible eyes fixed on me as if he could see through my soul. I was frozen, unable to move or think clearly. He held the relic of the gate opener, a pulsating object that seemed to vibrate with a strange, almost living energy. It was as if the cosmos itself was trapped inside it. "You still don't understand, Kale," he said, his voice echoing like 1,000 whispers at once. "Did you think you were here by chance? That you simply stumbled upon this forgotten moon?" I shook my head, trying to find words, but my throat was dry. "No," he continued, stepping closer. "You were chosen. From the moment you landed here, I knew you would be useful. Your mind, your human essence, is exactly what I needed to activate this relic." "For what?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. "What does it do?" The merchant chuckled softly, a sound that echoed through the chamber like the tinkling of shattered glass. "This relic," he explained, lifting it until it shone brilliantly, "is a key. a door to other realities. But for it to work, it requires something very specific. A human sacrifice, someone whose curiosity brought them here. Someone like you. I stepped back, searching for an escape. But the doors had vanished. The ship had changed, its walls now shifting as if made of living shadows. "Wait," I said, raising my hands defensively. "You can't just use me like this." The merchant tilted his head as if genuinely surprised by my reaction. "Why not? You came here out of curiosity. Why else would anyone explore a forgotten moon in the middle of nowhere? You wanted something. Interesting, and now you found it." He extended his free hand, and I felt my body being pulled forward, as if an invisible force was dragging me. I struggled, but it was useless. My vision began to darken, and the last thing I saw was the merchant's sinister smile as he murmured, "Be grateful, Kale. You're about to open doors that no one else could." And then everything went black. I woke up, but this time I was too weak to react. He used my vital essence to open something, and he spoke again. But this time, not to me, but to someone. Someone I couldn't see. Someone who was watching us.
"Oh, you're still here. Hello, traveler. You thought this story was about Draven, didn't you? That he was just another lost miner, another fool drawn in by curiosity. But you were wrong. You were never just a spectator. You never had that privilege. From the moment you started watching, from the moment you let your curiosity pull you in, you became part of this. You think stories are safe, that fiction is just fiction, that you can walk away untouched. But every time you listen, every time you watch, you open a door that lets me in. And now, I'm here. You humans are so desperate for answers. You build your machines, send your ships into the dark, dig into things you were never meant to touch. And yet, you never stop to ask, what is watching back? But it doesn't matter anymore. You've already paid the price. This story doesn't end. Not here. Not ever. It will follow you. In your mind. In your dreams. In the empty spaces between your thoughts. Where I now reside. This is the book of stolen memories. Every choice you've made. Every thought you've had. Every secret you keep locked away. It's all here now. And it belongs to me. You can turn off the video. Try to forget. Try to pretend this was just a story. But I will be watching. I will be waiting. Because human curiosity is a door that never truly closes. Until next time, traveler.
My name is Ethan Grayson. I am an explorer. At least I was before this mission became something else entirely. We were sent to Ophion 6 to investigate the disappearance of the mining colony. The expectations were simple. Maybe a structural collapse, a supply chain failure, or even a mutiny among the workers. We had protocols for all of those scenarios. Land, assess, recover any survivors, and return home. But now, my only mission is survival. Ophion 6 loomed below us like a blackened eye, a dead world adrift in the void. No oceans, no atmosphere, no life. Just a wasteland of volcanic rock scarred by impacts older than humanity itself. With every rotation, its shadow stretched wider, as if swallowing the stars, as if swallowing us. The descent began. The Vanguard 12 cut through the silence of space, its thrusters igniting as we broke orbit and dipped toward the surface. The colony's last known coordinates were just beyond a ridge of jagged stone, nestled in a valley carved from eons of erosion. That was when the static began. Our monitors flickered, drowning in white noise. Every signal, gone. No distress beacons. No radio chatter. Not even the automated systems that should have been running. Just silence. We expected to find the mining encampment, the metal-framed shelters, the heavy drilling equipment. What we found was a village. But it was no ordinary village. The structures were ancient, built from an unnatural black stone that seemed to drink in the dim light. The buildings stood at odd angles, their walls crude but impossibly sturdy. And then there were the towers, twisting spirals that pierced, the sky like the ribs of some long-dead titan, their surfaces etched with symbols that shifted when you weren't looking at them. The air, though there was no air, felt thick, heavy, suffocating. At the village's center stood the church. It defied architecture. It defied sense. The roof, razor-sharp, was buried deep into the ground, while its pointed base rose toward the heavens. The black stone it was built from was impossibly smooth, reflecting our warped, elongated shapes as we approached. The only entrance was at the top, an open doorway yawning like a mouth. A spiraling staircase led up to it, twisting in ways that made my stomach turn. That was when we saw them, the villagers. They were already there, watching, waiting, silent. Their faces were pale, their eyes deep pits of nothingness. No fear, no curiosity, no recognition of us as intruders or saviors. They only stared. Something about their presence made my skin crawl, an unshakable wrongness pressing against my instincts. They shouldn't be here. Ophion 6 had no records of indigenous life, no documentation of a secondary colony, and yet they stood before us, as if they had always been there. Then, one of them stepped forward. A man, tall, impossibly thin, draped in robes as dark as the stone beneath us. His face was stretched tight, his skin nearly translucent, as though something beneath it was pushing outward, waiting to break free. When he spoke, his voice was a whisper against the vast silence. "Welcome. You are already where you are meant to be." A chill ran through me. We should have turned back, but we didn't. We stayed. Cole was the first to vanish. There were no screams, no trace, no sound. We were exploring one of the empty houses when it happened. 1 second he was right behind me. The next, nothing. "Cole?" I called, turning around. Silence. Only the faint wind sweeping the moon's dust, sliding through the cracks between the houses. The air felt heavier, charged with something unseen, something watching. I blinked a few times, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked at Ramirez and Decker. Both were pale, tense. "This doesn't make sense," Ramirez muttered, adjusting the communicator in her ear. "Cole, respond. Where the hell are you?" Static. I walked to where he had been just seconds. Ago. No extra footprints, no clues. Nothing to indicate he had even moved. It was as if the universe had simply decided to erase him from existence. Then we heard it, something scratching through the communicator. It wasn't a human voice. It was wet. Organic. Like something crawling through the radio frequencies trying to mimic human sounds, but failing. A slow, garbled whisper slid through the static, not words, but something close to them. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. That was when I realized something was very, very wrong. We should have left. But we stayed. Ramirez disappeared that same night. We found her in the middle of the village, standing still, looking up. Her mouth was moving, murmuring something we couldn't understand. The villagers stood around her in a circle, watching in silence, as if they were waiting for something to happen. My stomach turned. "Ramirez?" I called. Nothing. When I stepped closer, I saw her eyes, glazed over, lost in the black sky. Her mouth kept moving, but no sound came out. "Ramirez, talk to me." I touched her shoulder, and then her eyes truly opened. She looked at me, but her mouth kept murmuring as if it no longer belonged to her. Then something shifted. Her Skin rippled as if something was writhing beneath it. And then, it happened. Something came out of her. Black, twisting, thin as strands of hair, yet moving too fast. First from her mouth, then her eyes, then her nostrils. Tentacles, long, writhing, shifting like roots beneath the skin. Ramirez trembled. Her body arched backward in a way that was all wrong, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. The tendrils consumed her, swallowing her form, spreading like a living disease. My God, shoot, shoot! Decker raised his weapon and opened fire. The bullets tore through Ramirez or whatever she had become. But it didn't matter. The creature didn't bleed. It didn't fall. It just kept moving, as if the lead was meaningless. Then we heard the sound. Footsteps on stone. More and more of them. I looked around. The villagers were closing in. Silently. Methodically. As if they already knew the hunt was over. Their faces were expressionless, their hollow eyes fixed on us. But there was something wrong about their movement. They swayed, their limbs bending in ways that shouldn't be possible, as if something else controlled them from within. Decker's breathing grew ragged. "We need to run," he whispered, but there was nowhere to run, and that was when I understood they had already won. Decker and Huang were next. I heard their screams as they were dragged into the darkness beneath the inverted church, their voices swallowed by the earth itself. By the time I turned to help, it was too late. The villagers, those hollow-eyed, silent figures, had already vanished with them into the abyss. I ran. There was nowhere to go, but I ran anyway. I stumbled through the barren landscape, my boots kicking up clouds of black dust. My breath was ragged, my vision blurred with sweat and panic. The Vanguard 12 was my only hope, my last chance to leave this cursed place. I saw its silhouette in the distance, waiting like a lifeline in the void. But as I reached it, the ground, beneath me, moved. A deep, wet crack echoed through the air. The land split apart, and I fell into the maw of the world. I woke to suffocating heat, moist, thick, the kind of heat that clings to your skin, seeps into your lungs. My body was sprawled across something warm and pulsating. My fingers sank into a surface that wasn't quite stone, wasn't quite flesh. It pulsed beneath me like the beating of an unseen heart. That was when I realized I wasn't in a cave. I was inside something. The tunnels around me weren't tunnels. They contracted like veins pumping lifeblood through a colossal body. The walls shuddered with slow rhythmic movements, a grotesque mimicry of respiration. The black rock of Ophion 6 wasn't rock at all. It was hardened flesh, ancient, and vast. Ophion 6 wasn't a moon. It was a living organism, and I was trapped within it. I pressed my palm against the surface, feeling it ripple under my touch. It responded. It recognized me. A deep hum filled the air, not a sound but a vibration, reverberating in my bones. My breath came in shallow gasps as I staggered forward, deeper into the chasm that had swallowed me. Then I saw it. At the center of the cavernous expanse, embedded within a pulsing mass of tissue and darkness, it was waiting. The heart of the world. It was a colossus, a writhing monolith of black tendrils, its form stretching endlessly through the tunnels like the roots of some ancient, impossible god. The tendrils slithered through the stone flesh, burrowing into the surface, twisting upwards, toward the land above, and at the ends of those tendrils, people dangled. The villagers, connected, controlled. Their limbs were limp, their mouths slightly open, but their eyes moved. They watched me, not with fear, not with suffering, but with an eerie, knowing calm. A realization struck me like ice water down my spine. They had never been human, or perhaps they weren't anymore. A shuddering breath escaped my lips as I took a step back. My instincts screamed at me to run, to fight, to do something, but the air felt heavy, thick with something invisible, something I could not escape. And then behind me, a voice spoke. "Now you see, don't you? I turned. Father Luther stood there, his face barely holding itself together. His skin sagged, thin and translucent, as if soaked through and ready to peel away at the slightest touch. His eyes, those cavernous, endless voids, held no reflection, no light, only emptiness. He smiled. "You think we came from the stars, Ethan? That we discovered Ophion 6? He took a step forward. "You think we are the explorers? The pioneers?" I tried to step back, but the ground pulsed beneath me, keeping me in place. The tendrils of the Colossus shifted, responding to my fear. Luther's hand, cold as death, cupped my face. Or was it Ophion 6 that discovered us? A tremor racked through me, and in that moment I understood. We had never been. The first, the mining colony, just another cycle, another offering, another group that had answered the call just as we had, just as others had before them. Forgotten ships, vanished expeditions, names erased by time. Ophion 6 had always been alive, and it had always been waiting. The tendrils moved. One slithered toward me, its surface glistening in the dim light, black as the abyss beyond the stars. The first touch was impossibly delicate, a whisper of cold against my skin. Then the whispers began. Not in my ears, in my mind. Faint at first, fragments of thought, scattered voices drifting like echoes in an endless cavern. But then, the words sharpened, took form, became understandable. They spoke of unity, of connection, of a vast consciousness that pulsed beneath the moon's surface, linking every soul, every body, every thought. There was no death within it, no pain, no fear. Cole was there. Ramirez was there. I could feel them, not as corpses, not as lost souls, but as something greater. They had not perished. They had ascended. And then I saw flashes of memory, not my own. Visions of acceptance. The moment they let go. The moment they understood. My heart pounded in my chest as my fingers trembled at my sides. The terror, the fight, the resistance, they all suddenly seemed so small, so insignificant. I lifted my eyes to the sky, to the gaping black void above, to the stars that no longer felt like home. All my life, I had feared that the greatest horror of the universe was discovering that we were alone. But the truth was far, far worse. We had never been alone. Ophion 6 did not seek to destroy us. It only needed us to understand. And so, I let the tendrils embrace me. I felt them sink beneath my flesh, unraveling me thread by thread, reshaping what I was into something beyond my comprehension. My mind stretched, expanded, became part of something vast, something eternal, and for the first time, I was at peace. I belonged. I was Ophion 6.
The dry air of the cabin is saturated with my own scent and traces of burned material from the control systems. I was supposed to simply fly over a wandering asteroid, collect data, and return, but an anomaly in the navigation system changed everything. A radiation storm? A software error? I'm not sure. All I know is that the alarms exploded in an infernal chorus, lights flickering as if the ship were possessed. Every attempt to regain control was futile. The gravity of an unknown planet took hold of me. The ship trembled, the dampers working at their limit. Accelerometers showed absurd readings. I was in freefall, controlled only by the hope that the hull would hold. The descent module pierced through dense layers of crimson clouds. Lilac lightning bolts sliced the sky, casting grotesque shadows on the mountains below. Atmospheric readings were catastrophic, toxic gases, crushing pressure. Without my suit, I would be a corpse in seconds. When I finally hit the surface, the impact was violent. The cabin tilted, groaning as if about to break apart. Shattered monitors flickered intermittently. The post-impact silence was deafening. woke up with dried blood covering my face and the visor of my helmet cracked. The acrid smell of burned insulators permeated the air. Outside the hatch, an alien horizon stretched, black mountains silhouetted against a venomous red sky. Rocks shimmered with a dull glow, as if excavated from the bowels of a mineral hell. The atmosphere was thick, laden with elements my initial readings could barely identify. The life support panel blinked incessantly. Fatal conditions. But I was not alone. They came at twilight, skeletal figures draped in rustic hides adorned with bones. Their eyes glowed with a mix of fear and reverence. I didn't know whether to raise my hands in peace or ready my pulse pistol. They decided for me. They knelt, touching their foreheads to the ground, murmuring words that vibrated like an ancient echo in the dense air. When I stumbled out of the crippled ship, still dazed and cautious, they scattered slightly, maintaining a respectful distance as if they had witnessed the descent of a god. My first contact with an extraterrestrial form of life was not a struggle for survival, but a ceremony of worship. Days stretched into a confusing sequence of constant twilight. Without the reference of a solar cycle, my sense of time deteriorated rapidly. The creatures who welcomed me seemed indifferent to this need. For them, time and survival were merely parts of the same flow. The village, formed by columns of black stone and grotesque leather tents, exuded an acrid smell, a mixture of smoked meat and unknown substances bubbling in rustic vats. The creatures moved with a disciplined silence, their slender bodies covered in scars symbolizing a history of rituals I did not yet understand. Led to the center of the village, I became a focal point of curiosity and reverence. They touched my helmet with trembling fingers, as if it held divine secrets. They pointed to the crimson sky and then to me, murmuring guttural words laden with meaning. Soon I understood. I was an emissary from the heavens. To repay their hospitality, I began demonstrating small technological advances. The simple light of my flashlight caused a commotion. Ecstatic cries echoed through the village as they danced around me in a nearly hypnotic frenzy. For a brief moment I was consumed by the illusion of power. But something was wrong. In the eternal nights, whispers propagated from the hills. Dark forms danced at the edge of my vision, and the natives became taciturn, avoiding my gaze. A sense of unease permeated the air. I tried to investigate on my own, but was gently prevented by the natives. They gestured frantically, pointing to a monumental cave in the distant hills. Something in that direction terrified them. Tension reached its peak when I was taken to the cave entrance. The air there was dense, saturated with a mineral smell that burned my nostrils. On the walls, primitive carvings told a disturbing story. Figures descending from the sky, worshipped with offerings and festivities, until they were delivered to the gods of the depths. My stomach churned. This was no honor awaiting me. It was a dark fate. I was not the first to be treated as a deity. The following morning, or what seemed like morning, I was ripped from sleep by screams that slashed through the air like blades. When I opened my eyes, I found a crowd of natives surrounding my tent. Their faces, once reverent, were now distorted, with feverish and inhuman expressions. Their eyes burned with a maddening fervor, an animalistic gleam that made my skin crawl. I tried to retreat, but it was too late. Rough hands seized me, their grip feverish and brutal. I fought with all my strength, tearing myself away from some of them. My racing pulse guided my hand to my pulse pistol. I fired. The energy beam vaporized two bodies in a shimmering explosion. A moment of silence spread through the crowd, a tense and chilling pause. But soon, desperate fury returned. Like a raging sea, they swallowed me. I was thrown to the ground, my limbs twisted and bound by crudely interwoven tendon strips. Around me, the natives chanted guttural hymns, primitive songs that vibrated in my mind like an insidious poison. The journey to the cave was a macabre procession. The ground beneath my bare feet seemed to pulse as if alive. and the air was laden with a nauseating stench of rotting flesh and ancient dampness. The shadows stretched unnaturally, flickering to the rhythm of indecipherable murmurs. They were not human voices. It was the planet whispering, hissing impure secrets that scraped the edge of my sanity. We arrived at the altar, a jagged black monolith, stained with fluids whose sickly glow seemed to pulsate under the dim light. My heart pounded in my chest, as my eyes were drawn to the fissure before me, a bottomless abyss from which a cold, fetid wind exhaled. Something was in there, something that breathed, something that waited. The cave walls were covered in runes that pulsed in sync with my own heartbeat, as if alive, feeding off the terror impregnated in the air. The voices of the natives rose in intensity, merging into a hypnotic symphony of crazed devotion. They forced me to my knees before the precipice. The priest emerged from the shadows, his body covered in scars carved with fanatical precision. He wore a robe made of blood-stained pelts, grotesquely stitched together. In his bony hands, he held an ancient blade, carved from bone, gleaming, with a sickly luminescence. His empty eyes overflowed with devotion as he raised the weapon. Then, the abyss exhaled. A deep, wet sound filled the cave, reverberating through the bones of my skull. From the darkness, eyes, dozens, hundreds, opened. Like distorted stars in a diseased cosmos, they watched me with hunger. Translucent tentacles emerged from the fissure, gliding through the air with grotesque elegance, tasting the fear-infused atmosphere. And then, something colossal and incomprehensible touched my mind. An ancient horror thundered through me. I felt my consciousness unravel piece by piece, sucked into the formless vastness of that infinite entity. Memories, identity, any trace of meaning, everything was devoured by an intolerable truth. The universe was not just vast. It was hungry. The natives' chants grew louder, their voices reaching an ecstatic climax. The priest advanced, blade raised, ready to offer my flesh to the unnameable. In the last instant, consumed by absolute desperation, I activated my suit's overload. The systems emitted sharp warnings as energy accumulated at a frantic pace. A white flash exploded in my vision. The world dissolved into fire and darkness. The screams of the natives and the primordial roar of the entity intertwined into a single apocalyptic howl, and then, nothing. Now, as I record this final message, my body slowly disintegrates under the radiation seeping from my fractured suit. The planet is silent once more, but I know the entity still lingers, waiting with infinite patience. I think of humanity. So, arrogant in its ceaseless pursuit of meaning, desperately clawing at the void, seeking answers from a universe that offers only indifference. We were made to gaze upon the stars, but never to comprehend them. Perhaps the natives were right to tremble before the gods of the sky. And if there is a god, perhaps it is not a benevolent architect, but something far closer to this insatiable abyss, a force that devours and reshapes existence without mercy, a hunger so vast it masquerades as purpose. My entire existence crumbles into dust before this horrific truth. Civilization, with all its technological wonders and intricate philosophies, is but a fragile illusion. We are flickering embers in a cosmic storm, ephemeral and meaningless, forgotten as swiftly as we are conceived. If this recording is ever found, let it stand as a warning. There are truths that must remain undiscovered. There are voids into which man must never gaze, for they do not merely gaze back. They reach, they hunger, and they consume. And we are nothing but dust, waiting to be scattered by the winds of the cosmos.
No quarantine protocol worked. After all, how do you contain something that shouldn't even be alive? The scientific vessel Pandora 9 floated silently in the Haumea Belt, a region beyond Pluto where intelligent asteroids emitted radio signals that defied human logic. Biologist Dr. Ilara Krios, A 40-year-old woman with eyes marked by emotional scars studied the readings from the biosignature scanner. She was naturally skeptical, still traumatized by a failed first contact mission years ago that had resulted in the death of her team. "Something's wrong here," Ilara murmured, adjusting the holographic controls. "These asteroids, they're not just emitting signals. They're responding." Chief Engineer Rin, a gaunt man with hollow eyes, addicted to neural stimulants to endure long space voyages, approached with a cup of synthetic coffee. "Responding to what exactly? There's nothing here but rock and ice." Ilara ignored the comment. Something about those signals unsettled her. They weren't random, they were structured like a language. Before she could investigate further, the collision alarm blared. "Impact imminent," the autopilot warned. The ship jolted violently, and the screens displayed a dark mass approaching. It wasn't an asteroid. It was something organic. The crew gathered on the command bridge to observe the creature through reinforced glass. It was colossal, the size of a cruiser, floating in the void as if sleeping. Its skin was a fusion of metallic scales and fungal tissue, with pulsating veins that glowed in ultraviolet frequencies. Its face, if it could even be called that, was a gaping cavity filled with silicon teeth, sharp as diamond blades. This is impossible," whispered Chief Medical Officer Dr. Vector, a pragmatic man who rarely showed emotion. "Nothing can survive in the vacuum without protection, let alone something this massive." A chill ran down Ilara's spine. The creature wasn't dead, it was hibernating. And worse, it was pregnant. At the center of its body, a pulsating bulge revealed the presence of translucent eggs, each the size of a human. Determined to study the creature, the crew used robotic arms to bring it aboard. The quarantine lab was prepared with Level 5 biosafety protocols, but nothing could have prepared them for what happened next. While collecting a tissue sample, Ilara's suit was pierced by a black spore that infiltrated her bone marrow. The pain was immediate, as if something was moving inside her. In that same instant, a voice echoed in her mind, guttural and ancient. "You will be the womb." Hours later, Ilara developed a high fever. Her skin displayed black patches shifting beneath the surface, as if something was feeding on her. Meanwhile, in the lab, the creature's eggs began to glow, emitting a pulsating light that caused the ship's instruments to fail. Rin, now visibly shaken, suggested destroying the creature and ejecting it into space, but Ilara knew it was too late. The spores were already aboard, and they were multiplying. The quarantine lab aboard Pandora 9 felt more like a nightmare than a scientific facility. The creature, now contained within a reinforced glass cocoon, exuded a sickly sweet stench, like rotting flesh mixed with poisonous flowers. Its veins pulsed in erratic rhythms, and the eggs in its womb glowed with a breath-like light. Dr. Ilara Krios, still weakened by fever and the black patches spreading across her body, insisted on leading the autopsy. "We need to understand what it is," she said, gripping a diamond scalpel with trembling hands, "before it understands us." The first incision revealed an anatomy that defied all biological logic. The creature had no distinct organs. Its interior was a hive of brain-like structures, each pulsing at different rhythms, as if they were independent hearts. A thick amber-colored liquid seeped from the cuts, coagulating mid-air into perfect geometric patterns before evaporating. "This isn't possible," murmured Chief Medical Officer Dr. Vector, recording the anomalies on his datapad. "These structures, they seem to be communicating with each other, as if they're part of a neural network." Ilara silently agreed. She felt a strange connection to the creature, as if the spores inside her body had linked her to something far greater. In her fevered moments, she glimpsed visions of a pulsating planet, where identical beings were worshipped as gods. Before they could continue the autopsy, the creature began to regenerate. The incisions sealed themselves, and the severed tissues reconstituted in mere seconds. The eggs in its womb pulsed more intensely, as if feeding off the ship's energy. "Shut off the lights," shouted Rin, the chief engineer, noticing the energy panels overheating. "It's draining our power." The crew obeyed, plunging the lab into darkness. The only illumination came from the eggs, now glowing in eerie shades of green and violet, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Desperate, Rin injected himself with a triple dose of neural stimulants to stay awake. His addiction led to a fatal mistake. He touched one of the eggs with his bare hand. Within minutes, bioluminescent tendrils sprouted from his arm, and he convulsed in agony. "He's merging with it," Ilara gasped, recoiling in horror. Rin did not respond. His eyes glowed with the same eerie light as the eggs, and his voice echoed as if spoken by many. "The swarm breathes in space. The swarm feeds on worlds." The mother creature awakened. Its silicon teeth vibrated, emitting a frequency that shattered the containment cocoon. Rin, now fully assimilated, opened the ship's airlock, screaming, "The swarm needs space!" The crew fought to seal the doors, but it was too late. The vacuum of space began sucking everything out, including fragments of the creature. Clinging to a support beam, Ilara watched as the eggs were pulled free, drifting into the void like malevolent stars. Amidst the chaos, she made a terrifying realization. The creature was not a singular entity. It was a messenger of an interstellar species, one that decomposed civilizations to sustain its life cycle. The scars on its body belonged to ships from 12 extinct species. Humanity was just the next victim. The Pandora 9 was in ruins. The vacuum of space had ripped away half of the quarantine lab, and the remaining corridors were coated in a viscous, bioluminescent substance glowing in hues of green and violet. The mother creature, now partially disintegrated, still pulsed at the center of the lab, its brain-like structures beating in chaotic rhythms. Dr. Ilara Cryos, weakened by fever and the blackened patches spreading across her body, dragged herself toward the command center. A sharp, pulsating pain radiated from her abdomen. Something was moving inside her. The voice in her mind was constant now, whispering phrases in a language she did not understand but felt deeply. "Ilara, we need to talk," said Chief Medical Officer Dr. Vector, intercepting her in the corridor. He looked haggard, dark circles under his eyes and an expression of pure despair. "The spores, they're spreading. Jax is dead, and Rin, well, you saw what happened to him." Ilara shook her head, trying to focus. "The eggs?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Gone," Vector replied. "Drifted into space, but that's not what worries me. It's you." He showed her a scanner reading. The embryo in her womb was not human. It was a cosmic chimera, a fusion of human and alien DNA, and it was growing rapidly. Meanwhile, Rin, the chief engineer, had become something beyond comprehension. His body was now a mass of bioluminescent tendrils with remnants of his human face still visible. He crawled through the corridors, muttering fragmented phrases. "The swarm breathes in space. The swarm feeds on worlds. The swarm is eternal." The remaining crew attempted to contain him, but their weapons were useless. Every wound they inflicted only made him grow stronger, feeding off the ship's energy and the spores now infesting the air. Ilara's visions became more vivid. She saw the pulsating planet again, but now she understood its purpose. It was a cosmic nursery, a spawning ground where creatures like the one they had encountered were cultivated and sent out to infect other civilizations. The swarm was not a species. It was a life cycle, a force of nature existing only to consume and reproduce. Then a horrifying realization struck her. The embryo inside her was not just an individual threat. It was a dimensional bridge, designed to open a portal for the swarm. Its birth would mean the end of humanity. Dr. Vector, grasping the full gravity of their situation, proposed a desperate plan. "We have to destroy the ship," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "If the swarm escapes, it will consume everything. The Federation, Earth, everything." Ilara hesitated. She didn't want to die, but she knew he was right. Before they could act, however, Rin appeared in the command center, his grotesque form blocking the exit. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice a chorus of echoes. "The swarm is not death. It is transformation. You will be part of something greater." Without hesitation, Vector activated the ship's self-destruct protocols. "Ilara, go!" he shouted, wielding a makeshift weapon. "I'll hold him." Off. Ilara ran, but not to escape. She knew the embryo inside her was the key to everything. If she could reach the mother creature, perhaps she could use her connection to the swarm to destroy it from within. In the lab, the mother creature had nearly finished regenerating. Its brain-like structures now beat in perfect unison, and the remaining eggs radiated with an intense glow. The embryo inside Ilara responded, recognizing its origin. The voice in her mind grew louder, clearer. "You are the womb. You are the door. Open us!" Ilara stared at the creature, tears welling in her eyes. "No," she whispered. "I am the end." And with that, she plunged into the creature's open maw, feeling her body merge with the entity. The embryo inside her screamed, but it was too late. Ilara had become part of the swarm. The Pandora 9 had become an alien ecosystem. The walls bled a thick amber fluid that shimmered in shades of green and violet, and the ship's control consoles had transformed into pulsating organic structures. The mother creature, now partially fused with Ilara Krios, dominated the quarantine lab, its brain-like masses synchronizing their rhythm with the embryo inside her. Dr. Vector fought to maintain his sanity. He had witnessed Rin's transformation into a mass of writhing tendrils, and now he watched as the ship itself became something alive and conscious. "This isn't an infection," he murmured, observing the walls as they pulsed. "It's assimilation." The ship's systems began to fail one by one. Lights flickered in erratic patterns and the computers emitted guttural noises as if trying to speak. The remaining crew, now only 3, gathered in the command center, scrambling. "For a solution, we have to destroy the ship," said Lena the pilot, clutching a plasma grenade. "If the swarm escapes, it will devour everything." "And Ilara?" asked Tarek, the technician, whose right arm was now covered in the same black patches as Ilara's. "She's gone," Vector said, his voice heavy with grief. "She's one of them now." As they argued, the mother creature fully awakened. Its silicon teeth vibrated, emitting a frequency that shattered the reinforced glass of the lab. Ilara, now unrecognizable, emerged from the creature's maw. Her body fused, with tendrils and brain-like masses. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice an eerie harmony of overlapping tones. "The swarm is not death, it is transformation. You will be part of something greater." While Vector and Lena distracted Rin and the mother creature, Tarek dragged himself to the ship's core. His infection now covered half his body, and he knew he didn't have much time left. With trembling hands, he connected the detonator to the core, preparing the overload. "Ilara," he whispered, looking toward the lab. "I can feel you. I understand now." Ilara's voice echoed in his mind, soft and maternal. "You will be the womb. You will be the door." Tarek smiled, his tears mixing with the amber fluid coating his face. "Not today," he said, pressing the detonator. The ship's core overloaded, unleashing a wave of energy that annihilated everything in its path. The mother creature howled as its brain masses ruptured, spraying golden ichor. Rin was vaporized, his tendrils disintegrating into luminescent particles. Ilara, still fused with the creature, looked at Tarek with deep sorrow. "You cannot stop," she whispered, just before the explosion consumed her. At the last moment, Vector and Lena escaped in an emergency pod, watching Pandora 9 erupt into a supernova of fire and alien matter. But then, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The eggs that had drifted into space began to glow, opening small portals to the pulsating planet. "It's not over," Lena whispered, her face pale with horror. "They're coming." The emergency capsule floated in the vacuum, far from the wreckage of Pandora 9.
Dr. Vector and Lena watched in silence as the ship exploded in a cascade of light and molten metal. But the relief was short-lived. "Look," Lena whispered, pointing at the debris. The eggs that had drifted into space began to glow with an unbearable intensity. Small portals opened around them, revealing glimpses of the pulsating planet, a world of living flesh and colossal brains, where creatures like the one they had encountered were bred and sent to infect other civilizations. "They're coming, Vector," said his voice heavy with despair. "We need to warn the Federation." Before they could act, a figure emerged from the wreckage. It was Ilara Krios, or what was left of her. Her body was unrecognizable, fused with tentacles and cerebrozoids, but her eyes still held a glimmer of humanity. "You cannot run," she whispered, her voice echoing in Vector and Lena's minds. "The swarm is already here. I am the gate." Ilara floated toward the capsule, her tentacles extending like the roots of a cosmic tree. Vector and Lena backed away, but they knew there was nowhere to run. Vector, in a moment of clarity, realized that Ilara still had some control over the swarm. "Ilara," he said, looking at her with pain-filled eyes. "You can stop them. You can close the portal." Ilara hesitated. The voice of the swarm in her mind was overwhelming, but she could still hear her own voice, faint and distant. I don't know how," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Use the embryo," Lena said, holding the improvised detonator that Tarek had used. "It's the key. If you destroy it, the portal might close." Ilara looked at the embryo in her womb, now nearly fully formed. It pulsed with an intense light, as if aware that its birth was near. The voice of the swarm in her mind grew louder, more insistent. "You are the womb. You are the gate. Open us." Ilara closed her eyes, feeling tears slide down her deformed face. She knew what had to be done. "Go," she whispered, looking at Vector and Lena. "I will hold them here." Before they could protest, Ilara used her tentacles to push the capsule away, toward the edge of the star system. Vector and Lena screamed, but it was too late. Ilara was already moving toward the eggs, her body glowing with an intense light. "I am the end," she whispered before activating the detonator. The explosion was cataclysmic. The eggs were vaporized, and the portals began to close. The swarm roared in fury, its voices echoing through the vacuum like a scream of pain and rage. When the cosmic dust settled, there was no sign of Ilara or the eggs. The portals were closed, and the pulsating planet had vanished. Vector and Lena floated in silence, witnessing the destruction from afar. They knew that Ilara's sacrifice had saved humanity, but they also knew that the swarm would not be easily forgotten. "She did this for us," Lena whispered, her tears floating in the vacuum. "No," Vector replied, his face dark. "She did this for all of us." The emergency capsule drifted toward the edge of the star system, carrying the only survivors of Pandora 9, Dr. Vector and Lena. The silence inside the capsule was oppressive, broken only by the soft hum of the life support systems. Both knew that Ilara's sacrifice had sealed the portal to the swarm, but they also knew the price had been immense. "She did this for us," Lena whispered, her tears floating in the vacuum. "No," Vector replied, his face dark. "She did this for all of us." When the capsule was rescued by a Galactic Federation ship, Vector and Lena were placed under strict quarantine. They reported everything that had happened, but their stories were met with skepticism. The Federation was not prepared to accept the existence of a cosmic entity like the swarm. "You're in shock," the intelligence officer said, reviewing the reports. Pandora 9 was destroyed due to a core failure. Nothing more. Vector and Lena knew it was pointless to argue. The Federation was more interested in maintaining order than facing the truth. In the months that followed, Vector and Lena were subjected to a series of medical and psychological examinations. Both showed signs of post-traumatic stress, but no evidence of infection from the swarm's spores. Still, Vector noticed something strange. His old scars began to itch, and he had recurring dreams of the pulsating planet. Lena, on the other hand, began to hear whispers in her mind, especially when she was alone. They were faint at first, but grew louder each night. "You are the womb," the voices whispered. "You are the gate." Meanwhile, in a remote space station, a scientist analyzed debris recovered from the Pandora 9 explosion site. Among the wreckage was a fragment of a neural implant with burn marks. When he touched it, his screens flickered 3 times. In the reflection of the glass, he saw Ilara behind him, black eyes, smiling. "Did you really think it was over?" The Galactic Federation classified the Pandora 9 incident as a biohazard level 5 accident. No trace of the creature or the eggs was found, until probes on Mars detected black spores growing in the red sands. In a lunar colony, a baby was born, with completely white eyes. Its first word was swarm, and as it cried, the colony's lights flickered 3 times. On the medical monitor, its DNA showed sequences identical to those of the creature. Vector and Lena were discharged from active service, but they never fully recovered. They knew the swarm had not been defeated, only delayed. "They're here," Lena whispered one night, staring at the starry sky. "They've always been here." Vector did not respond. He knew she was right. The swarm was more than a cosmic entity. It was a cycle of life, a force of nature that existed to consume and reproduce. And humanity was just another step in its journey. In a hidden laboratory on a space station in the Purple Lagoon, scientists examined the fragment of a neural implant found among the wreckage of Pandora 9. They didn't know what it was, but they were determined to find out. "Incredible," one of the scientists murmured, observing the readings. "It seems to be alive." At that moment, the lab lights flickered 3 times.